Hello, I'm Andy Lester. I'm the Head of Conservation for the wildlife charity Rocha UK, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about the state of nature and what we can do about the current crisis we're in. Well, we're facing a crisis on a lot of fronts at the moment. The first is coronavirus, the second, climate change, and the third is habitat and species loss. So, from multiple places, we're feeling bombarded at the moment by bad news. Let's start with corona, and some of you will be saying, well, what on earth has corona got to do with the environment? And some of you will be familiar with the ideas of where it originated. Many people say it originated in a wet food market in central China. And the challenge, of course, with that is that that food market, like many in China, were full of animals that were taken from the wild, from rainforest areas, from areas where wild animals thrived and now don't. And it is entirely possible that coronavirus started in a wild bat species, and that wild bat in the marketplace then passed this unknown coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, on from a wild animal to a person. Now, others are saying, well, maybe it was created in a lab, but all the scientists agree that the most likely cause is the connection between taking animals from the wild and then bringing them into close proximity with people. Many bat species, along with many other mammal species, carry lots of unknown pathogens that at some time in the future could provide the next pandemic for the world. So the coronavirus crisis is a symptom of a much greater cause, a much greater problem. And the second is climate change. So if you think of corona as being a bit of a tidal wave, climate change is significantly greater. I'm standing here on a very hot July day, and just a few days ago I was at our main offices in Southall, and the outdoor temperature reached a sweltering 37.8 degrees Celsius. That's 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. It was perhaps the third highest ever recorded temperature in the London area, and goes to show that records like last year are being broken on an almost annual basis. But the heat is not the main problem of the climate change. It's far more complicated than that. From the fires in Australia to increased storm events across both the West and East Atlantic, to more hurricanes tracking their way from Africa across to America, and cyclones of greater ferocity across the Indian Oceans. We're seeing our climate systems break down. We're also seeing many familiar species lost as a result, and we're seeing the decline and the decay of the ice caps, both out in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, as new land appears and the ice melts. So that presents us with significant challenges, both to our seawater as it loses its salinity, and also to drinking water, where drinking water amounts are rapidly reducing, for example in the Himalayas as the glaciers melt. So we're faced with an existential crisis on climate, and for the last 20 years governments have been working really hard to try and keep the temperatures within 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. We think that is looking increasingly unlikely now, and as we go into COP26 next year, one of the things that we have to consider carefully is the impact of a climate change world in which we're not looking at a 1.5 degrees temperature rise, but maybe a 2.5 or maybe even a 3. And what are the implications for that? They're stark for water supply, they're stark for food consumption, and they're stark for our own very survival in more vulnerable areas of the planet. And so the combination of corona and climate leave many to feel quite hopeless. And if that wasn't enough, on top of that, we've got substantial habitat loss and the loss of species. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature indicated that upwards of 200 species are becoming extinct every single day. Think of it as like diamonds, facets on a diamond, and that each time a species disappears, it's like a facet being scrawled out, and that diamond begins to lose some of its luster. We worship an incredibly faithful God, and a God who created nature in abundance. And yet one of the things that we are currently doing is destroying that abundance. Just a couple of days ago, I heard the shocking news that the Australian wildfires of last year are thought to have killed or maimed upwards of 3 billion mammals in Australia. A really shocking statistic, a large percentage of mammals. And there are a number of species, like the koala bear, that are now known as functionally extinct. In other words, so many of them have been wiped out that were another disease or another crisis to come along, it could finish off the entire population of koala. And of course, we're very aware of the crisis facing other species impacted by climate, from the polar bear in the Arctic through to the pandas in China, and through to amphibians and frog species in Central and South America, and migrating birds coming up from South America to North America and from South Africa to Europe each year. So we're facing a crisis. And we're also facing a crisis of imagination. We see in this country a push to build more and more and more houses, but with less and less space for nature. And so often we find ourselves in little spaces like this. This is my back garden, and you'll probably see down here my attempt with my wife at growing some vegetables. We'll come back to that in a moment. But nature is being confined into smaller and smaller spaces, both as a result of climate change, as a result of habitat and species loss, and to an extent reflected in the pandemic that we see, where nature and man are in proximity at a level that they shouldn't be, and where disease is what may result. So how do we cope with the level of change that we face? How do we find hope, and how do we find peace in a place of challenge? Romans 8 talks about creation groaning for liberation from the bondage of decay. And I do absolutely believe that we are in a season where nature is groaning, it's crying out for redemption. And one day that redemption will come in the form of Christ's return. But in the meantime, what are we called to be? We are ultimately called to be Christ's hands and his feet. Like the good and faithful servant, we are called to invest the money in the work here and now to advance God's kingdom. We're not called to sit on our investment in the hope that it might magically grow. So what 5 things can we do then as a faith and church community to take action for nature and for people? The first, I would argue, is prayer. In the last 2 years of my grandmother's life, one of the things that she said was, I can't get out of my bed, but I can pray. And I do believe that prayer makes a difference. Those were her words. We know of experiences in our own family life of answered prayer as well as unanswered prayer. But ultimately, we know that it is worth praying for change. We're in a world which has gone dramatically wrong, where sin is prevalent, where the impacts on the planet are felt and seen daily. And yet we also believe that we serve a cross of Christ, in which part of the redemptive power of the cross is the power of prayer, that we are praying to a Father in heaven who loves us profoundly. So prayer for change for the planet is of critical importance. The second is practical action. And this is where my fruit and veg come in. So I do believe that if you only have a small space, it may be a few garden pots, it may be just a little bit of a flower border, you can do incredible things. And 3 months ago, we planted some broad bean seeds. My expectation was that they wouldn't do very much, and yet they are just now beginning to produce, as you can see, broad beans from just 5 little seeds. And that amazes me, how new life can flourish if it's given the opportunity. It's given the water, it's given the soil. And so we're called to be a people who water the soil, who tend the soil. In Genesis chapter 1, it talks about Adam, the first man. Adam comes from the word Adamah, of the soil. And we are, at the end of the day, earth creatures. Without this stuff, we wouldn't be able to eat. We need the soil. So practical action then is all about getting out there and getting your hands dirty. what does it mean in practice? Well, it could mean going and helping at one of the A Rocha reserves at Foxearth on the Suffolk border, or at Woolfields in London. It could be about connecting with one of our Partner in Action projects. We've got partners around the country doing amazing things, from Ashburnham Estate in East Sussex through to Lee Abbey in Devon and Scargill House in Yorkshire. So we've got a number of places you can visit and you can get your hands dirty and get involved. We've also got Eco Church, the church award scheme. What a brilliant opportunity to go for bronze, silver or gold award for your church, to green your church. And there's already over 2,500 churches engaged in nature in that way. And for top tips, we have Wild Christian. You can sign on and get regular emails which give you advice on things that you can do for nature. And more broadly, why don't you think about joining your wildlife trust and volunteering on a local nature reserve, or getting out and doing volunteer work with the RSPB or other national organisations? So prayer and practical action are two key things, and the practical action can be right down to the beans, really small scale stuff. But as we're standing here now and watching 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bees enjoying the flower on the broad beans and providing a pollination service, even in tiny areas, we can find reason to hope. And then the third is petition. If we see things that are profoundly wrong, then it's up to us to challenge it. And we have to remember that the church in the UK alone is made up of over 1 million members. So think about an empowered church that's decided to take action on climate change by lobbying your local MP. Or maybe you're lobbying your MP on local housing development or on single-use plastic. Or maybe it's on new cycle paths or shutting off town centres permanently so that people can enjoy the town centres free of traffic. Whatever the environmental issue that's close to your heart, there is an opportunity to contact your MP and make a noise. And if it's done collectively as a church, you carry even more weight, because you represent a big section of the electorate, and people will change policy in government if enough members of the public say, we don't agree with that. So prayer, practical action, petition, and then the fourth is persistence. Change doesn't come overnight. And to illustrate this, there's a little patch here to the left of my broad beans where we planted 3 lettuces, and all 3 lettuces managed to get eaten by some local animal. We then planted some carrots yesterday, and one of our delightful children landed a football on my one louse carrot. And also when I went to dig up the carrot was only about half an inch high. It's a message that sometimes we can try really hard and actually the results aren't really up to scratch. And God says that's okay. It is okay to persist and to know that your efforts are not in vain. That eventually you might end up with some broad beans that look fantastic rather than a carrot that looks squashed and on the ground and only 1/4 inch high. So be a persistent people. So prayer and persistence, practical action and petition are all vital. And petition particularly in the context of some of the big global issues, and prayer certainly in the context of not just wanting to see the world change, but also saying, I need strength for the day, because sometimes we can feel hopeless. And that's then of course where the practical action and the petition and the persistence pay off, because if you are persistent and something amazing does happen, then what you do is eventually you end up with some beans that look like that. And that excites me. That's new life. It gives me hope. It inspires me. And then the final thing is praise. We've talked a lot in these few minutes about the state of nature and about the state of the planet and the fact that creation is groaning, and that sometimes the things that we can do seem remarkably small. But let's praise God for the good things, whether it's broad beans or flowers or bees or migrating birds, whether it is the sunshine despite the potential threats caused. Maybe it's the blossom trees, maybe it's the roses, maybe it is just the fact that we are alive. Let's not forget to praise a loving God. Let's not forget to put our arms out as he did on the cross and embrace others and say, it's okay, there is hope, there is reason to have joy, there's reason to praise. So as we come to the end of this short talk, let's remember three things. The first is that, yes, we're in a place of great suffering at the moment, but there is also tremendous opportunity to hope and to rejoice. And finally, small actions can make an enormous difference. Small actions inspire others to act. It's like a domino effect. You flick one domino and God can do the rest. We're called to be a generation that just push on the dominoes that we can impact, and then we allow others and we allow God to do the rest. We can't change the world overnight, but we can go out and grow broad beans. And sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't. But God enjoys our efforts. And ultimately we know that one day he will return. And ultimately we know that we will see a renewed heaven and a renewed earth where sin and death are wiped away. But for the time being, let's rejoice in what we have and let's fight for what we're at risk of losing. Thank you.